Welcome back to the Tamarack Sew Along. In today's lesson, I'll discuss the specifics involved in cutting your tamarack. If you missed our previous lesson on pattern adjustments, you can find that in our YouTube profile under the Tamarack Sew Along playlist. I hope you all have your patterns cut out and ready to go, because it's time to grab those scissors and get cutting. Before we get started with our fabric, let's briefly talk about how woven fabric is made. As you can see in this image, woven fabric is constructed by weaving horizontal weft yarns over and under a series of vertical warp fibers. This action is done on a loom. The horizontal weft yarns run along what we call the cross grain, and the vertical warp yarns form the straight grain. At either edge, running along the length of the fabric, is the selve edge. This is a tightly woven edge finish created during manufacturing, and this is what you'll align your pattern's grain line with. Now we'll discuss pre-treating and prepping your fabric. You'll want to pre-wash and dry your fabric prior to cutting to reduce or eliminate shrinkage in your final garment. Make sure you wash your yardage using the same method and settings that you're planning to use to wash your finished garment. So say you want to wash your finished tamarack on cold, you'd wash your yardage on cold. Same thing with the dryer. Now for your batting, you are not going to pre-wash that. It should be pre-treated to reduce shrinkage. So do not throw this giant thing in the wash. You will regret it. The reason we pre-treat our fabric is the last thing you want is your garment shrinking after you finished it and you spent so much time getting that fit right. Once out of the dryer, you'll want to give your fabric a good press. Cutting is always easier on a nice flat fabric, so don't skimp on this step. If you're working with a particularly wrinkly fabric like linen, taking the fabric out of the dryer just before it's completely bone dry and pressing it then can really help. The next step in cutting your pieces is laying out the fabric. Laying out your fabric is pretty straightforward. First off, you're going to need to determine the right and wrong side of your fabric. If you're using a printed fabric, this is easy. The printed side is the right side. Solid fabrics and fabrics with woven designs can be a bit harder. There are too many types of woven fabrics to cover them all here, but if you can't tell which is the right or wrong side, here are a few clues that might help. Check the selve edge. Sometimes fabric manufacturers will print text on the selve edge. The text is almost always on the right side. So here you can see this is a two-sided fabric, so it's easy to tell. Two-sided as in the front and back are different. So here's the printed front and the white back. And here you can see the text is on the right side of the fabric. So that should hold true for most fabrics. If the selve edge has holes, the raised side will most likely be the right side due to the way fabric is finished, though there are exceptions to this rule. So this is hard to see, but there are tiny little holes in the selve edge, and if you feel them, they're rough on this side and smooth on this side, and again, front and back. If you still can't tell which side is the right or wrong side, then all you have to do is pick the side you like best. When doing this, make sure you mark one side of all of your pattern pieces as you cut as either the right or wrong side to avoid confusion during the sewing process. For example, you can place a chalk mark, a piece of tape, or a safety pin on the right side of each piece to make sure the final garment has the right side facing out consistently. I'll now walk you through cutting each part of the Tamarack jacket, starting with the lining. Start by laying out your fabric with the selve edges together. A lot of people have you fold the fabric with the right side together, but I like to fold it so the wrong sides are together. It's less important when you're using an all over like small print like this, but if you have a larger print or something with a texture, you can more easily see where each piece of the print will fall on the pattern. So that's why I like to do right sides out. Once your selve edges are aligned, check to make sure there's no torquing at the folded edge. So here you can see this is nice and smooth. What I mean by torquing is if the fabric isn't laid out quite right, When you move your fabric up here, you can see we're starting to get lines going in this direction. To straighten that out, you just need to adjust your selve edges. And I like to do this sort of little nail scoot. It's something I learned while working in bridal doing patterns. It's just a nice way to move the top layer of the fabric while keeping the under layer stationary. Now that our fabric is properly laid out, it's time to place our pattern pieces. To lay out your pattern pieces, start by locating the cutting diagrams in your instruction booklet. Each of our patterns has a complete set of cutting diagrams, which we've designed to give you the best fabric yield. Select the layout that matches your fabric width, pattern size, and which version of the pattern you're cutting. One thing to keep in mind with these layouts is that we have not laid them out for directional fabric. Directional fabric is a fabric with a clear top and bottom to the print or design, such as flowers with a stem, people, etc. When cutting directional fabric, you'll want to make sure that the tops of each pattern piece align with the top of the print. As you can see here, the cutting layout for the Tamarack has piece 1 and piece 2 facing opposite directions. If this were directional fabric, we'd want to flip one of the pattern pieces so both pattern pieces are in the same direction. I weight my pattern pieces with professional cloth weights, but you can use anything. I get a lot of questions about these, so here we go. Cloth weights are also known as pattern weights, and they're made from cast iron and they weigh about 4 pounds each. They're made to weight a pattern to cloth while tracing and have a low profile that enables you to move around them easily. Pattern or cloth weights can be found at any pattern making supply store. Small cloth weights for home sewing are available at most sewing supply stores, or you can use washers, cans of food, or really anything heavy and relatively low profile works great. Another option for pattern weights is making your own. We have this little tutorial for these cute little pattern weights on our website. The pattern is free for newsletter subscribers, or I think about $5 for non-subscribers. So I will link these below, and also where you can sign up for our newsletter so you can make your own. Now the first step when laying out your pattern pieces is making sure that the grain line on the pattern is properly aligned with the selve edge. So what I'm going to do, take my ruler and just measure over from the selve edge to the grain line. All right, and that is aligned. So I'm going to weight my piece down. Now you can see here that the back says place on the fold. So you're going to do just that and place the pattern piece on the fold. This way we have a full back. Weight that down. And now we need to trace out our pieces. I prefer to trace around my pieces because I don't like cutting around my pattern. I like to make things more than once. And when you cut around your pattern, it's inevitable that you're going to nick the pattern. And the more you do that, the more beat up your pattern will get, and it won't be so useful anymore. And if you put together your own PDF, you know that it's not maybe the most fun activity in the world. So I like to only do that part once. So that's why I trace. It also gives you a bit more of an accurate piece. When you pin through a piece of paper like this, it raises the fabric a bit and you can get a little bit of a jag there. So that's just personal preference. Now, if you notice while I was tracing, I marked my notches. I have these cut out and I'm just marking into the pattern the length of the notch. So the seam allowance on this pattern is a 1/2 inch and the notches are 1/4. So we're going to clip those and you won't see that in the final garment. We also need to mark our pocket placement. I'm just doing this with a pin. You can use thread tacks, chalk, whatever you like, but I just use a pin. So remove your pattern piece, and then I usually just stick the pin through. And we're cutting 2 layers, so after I cut, I'll separate these 2. So now we need to trace out the back. Same thing. I'm using a number 2 pencil for my marking utensil. This is my favorite marking utensil of all time. I even used these in bridal, cutting people's wedding dresses, because when you're cutting, you want to cut away the line that you traced, so none of this is going to end up in your pattern. And you can see I am tracing the pencil into my pattern here, but it's going to be in the seam allowance, so it's not going to be a problem. If you're worried about that, what we did in bridal is trace and then make a line out, and then you'll just clip in when you get to that point. So there's nothing internally we need to mark on the back, so we can remove that pattern piece. Now we need to cut out our pieces. If you like, you can pin around the outside. I know that's really common. I find that the fabric, it's not really gonna come apart. It's pretty, I'm gonna use the word Velcro-y, which is not a word, but it sort of sticks together. It's not really gonna go anywhere while you cut. And then I have it weighted, so I am not going to pin mine down. But that, again, is personal preference. So we're just going to cut. I want to weight that down so it doesn't fall off the table. The fabric I'm cutting off right now. You can see I am cutting off the pencil line as I go. Now that this piece is cut, we need to clip our notches. So I'm just clipping into the seam allowance. And again, this is only halfway into the seam allowance, so it will not show through to your jacket, so don't worry about clipping in. It's just a lot easier than making those triangles or anything else. Continue cutting out your front. The center front notch is very important if you're going to be adding the hood or a collar, so don't forget that. And you can see how well the 2 layers stick together. It's not moving or going anywhere, so I don't find any need to pin. So you can remove these smaller pieces, and I'm going to keep the larger scraps. They're great for practicing your quilting. And then you'll just continue following the cutting layout diagram for your lining. Now, moving on to the main fabric. Okay, now we need to cut our main fabric. This is the fabric for the outside of the jacket. So if you're working with a fabric that doesn't have an all over print like this that you may want to align, you can go ahead and cut in the same manner you did for the lining. With this fabric, I want to make sure that these little motifs line up across the jacket. So I'll show you how I do that now. All right, so here we have the 3 main pieces for the body. 1, which is the front, 2, which is the back, and 3, the sleeve. So I'm going to use the underarm as sort of a baseline. I'm going to draw a line from the underarm across the pattern to the front, and I want that perpendicular to the grain line. Now again, we'll do that with the back. And finally the sleeve. Now here you can see how this line runs through all of the pattern pieces and everything will be aligned front to back. So set our pieces aside for a minute and let's talk about our fabric. So in theory, you could align them with the fabric folded. In reality, this print, the halfway point of the fabric, is not on a center line or anything of the print. So I'm going to cut this single layer. So to do that, I'm going to open up my fabric. And I am putting the right side up because I want to make sure I'm aligning things properly. Just going to weight down the top so it doesn't move while I cut. And now we're going to start aligning our pattern pieces. Okay, so here we have our fabric. I'm going to keep this line that I've drawn aligned with the center of these diamonds. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make sure those are aligned. The next thing is that I want this print to run smoothly across the center front. So this is the center front line. I'm making view B, so it will overlap. So I want the center front notch to hit the same point on both fronts. So I'm just going to align that. My fabric is a tiny bit torqued. So I'm going to weight down the top and just kind of pull on it a little bit, and now we are properly aligned. Smooth that. Weight and trace if you can find your pencil. Oh, right here. All right, so we're just going to trace around our piece. And again, I'm using my number 2 pencil. I just find it easy to see. And it traces very nicely. All right, so now that is our first piece. Really quick, we need to mark our pocket placement. Don't forget that. Then you're going to flip your pattern piece because you want two opposite pieces. And you can see here. So we're then going to flip our pattern piece because we want two opposite pieces. And we don't have our line drawn on the back. So again, all you need to do is underarm to the center front. Again, perpendicular to the center front or grain line. And then we're going to align this piece the same way we aligned our last one. So that's there. Just make sure so now we have this piece aligned in the same So now our two pieces are aligned properly. You can see our center notch hits at the same point, and our through line is through the center of the diamonds. So you can trace this one off now. And if you are cutting flat like I am, there is no diagram for this. Typically, cutting flat uses less fabric, but when you're matching a pattern like I am, the larger the pattern, the more fabric you'll need. It's impossible for me to calculate that for you. It will depend on how large your print is. I'll be able to cut this out of the required yardage, no problem. So if you have like a huge print, you're probably going to need more fabric to pattern match. If it's something like this, I think you'll be fine. Oops, again, I almost forgot to mark my pockets. And then it's time to cut out our fronts. I find cutting up and down a little awkward, so you may want to keep your selvage edges at the sides. I'm doing it this way because it's easier for you guys to see on camera if they're facing up and down. And our second piece. Make sure your notches are clipped. And there you have your two fronts. And here you can see how when the piece is folded, the pattern runs from one piece to the other. You'll need to continue cutting the rest of your pattern pieces in the same fashion. All right, next up we have our batting. So when you unwrap your batting, if you have the cotton, you're going to want to press it lightly at your iron. If you are using wool, you can kind of just run the steam over it, but I would not press your iron to it because it'll flatten the wool, little like layers, sandwich layers that create the wool batting. So for this, there's not really a grain line on here. The way it's constructed is fibers just kind of go willy-nilly. I do like to cut this single layer just because 2 layers is a little rough on my wrist. But that is up to you. So what I do, lay down my piece. And the pencils are really great because it's soft. This is a 2B pencil. That's the lead hardness. And it just traces so nicely on the batting. And I am not going to worry about notches or internal markings on this because they're already on our fabric. And I did just flip this pattern piece over because of habit. But this batting is the same on the front and back, so it doesn't matter if you cut with the wrong side up because both sides of the batting are the same. Now for the back, obviously we're going to need a full pattern piece, so make sure you have enough batting before you start tracing. I just start by tracing one side. I mark the center with a little mark. Then just flip the pattern piece over, align it, and continue tracing. A little hard to reach. Now, just simply cut around your pattern piece. And all of this is the same, no matter which size of the pattern you're making. The only difference for the 14 to 30 is that dart. So you'll just make sure you mark the dart point. All right, so there's our back. So just continue that until all of your batting pieces are cut. The final fabric we need to cut is our interfacing. You don't need much for this, so I'm just using a scrap. And we recommend using tricot or woven interfacing. You don't want to use the bonded interfacing. It's going to be too thick. You should save that for craft projects and bags, things like that. But we do want our interfacing to still preserve the drape of the fabric. So, woven and tricot interfacing does have a grain line. Luckily, it's easy to see. So you can just align your pattern piece with the grain line. And this is the one time I do cut around a pattern piece, because tracing onto interfacing is probably my least favorite part of sewing of anything. I would rather do pretty much anything than trace onto interfacing. And you all won't be on film, so it won't be so awkward. Right. So that's our first piece. And we just need one more. And again, you only need this. And this is for the welt pocket. If you're doing the patch pocket, you do not need to cut interfacing. And there are two interfacing pieces. Okay, so that is it for today's lesson and our prep work. In our next lesson, we'll be assembling and quilting our jacket pieces. I'll see you back here for that lesson, and if you have any questions, let me know in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed to our channel so you don't miss any of our video updates. Bye-bye.